Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell, and today's topic is Autumn in Yellowstone, Wildlife's Winter Prep Season with NatHab Expedition Leader Charlie Reinertsen. Thank you so much for being here today, Charlie. Over to you.
Thank you, Brooke, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm excited to talk about one of my favorite places in the world, the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. And that includes Grand Teton National Park and Yellowstone National Park. And you can visit these places with Natural Habitat Adventures. I'll be guiding a trip coming up in September. So I'm getting really excited to be seeing what the wildlife are doing in these places. And so I thought I would be able to talk about what what all of these charismatic megafauna are doing right now in the summer and then heading into the fall, and how those wildlife behaviors kind of change the way that we look for them. And if you're visiting Yellowstone during this season, what you can learn from these seasonal behaviors to be able to make sure that you have the best wildlife viewing experience possible. I'll share some fun facts along the way. These critters are some of the most interesting animals that I have had the chance to be able to study and observe. And so just to give you a quick rundown of our chat today, I'll introduce myself, talk a little bit about what I do, and then we'll talk about wildlife activity in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem in the fall. And finally, I'll wrap up with an itinerary overview of the Yellowstone and Grand Teton Wildlife Safari that's made possible with a trip with NatHab. So, just a little bit about me. I grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and this is a photo from one of my other favorite places in the world. And I fell in love with just discovering animals out in the world, and in particular frogs and turtles and snakes, and that led me to go on to study them. So in college I studied the conservation genetics of softshell turtles, and that is this turtle right here. And we were looking at their migratory movements, and we were trying to understand if males or females were responsible for more genetic diversity based on their movements by studying their genetics. And we were also studying the impact of dams on the Mississippi River that would prevent these turtles from being able to access all parts of their habitat. So that time with all of these turtles and frogs and snakes kind of opened the door to me for photography. I was in the field collecting data, working with all these species, and I also had a camera and I was taking photography classes. And I started to realize at the end of my research, as it was concluding, that I was just really excited about sharing information, sharing a love for science and a love for our discoveries in this field, more so than doing the research. And so that kind of set me on this path of working in the world of science communications in a number of different capacities, most recently as an exhibit developer here in Saranac Lake, New York, up in the Adirondack Park. And so my current job is working as a communications consultant, and it's brought me to so many incredible parts of the world. And one of the pieces of that business is actually working with Natural Habitat Adventures and World Wildlife Fund. I'm able to guide trips in Grand Teton and Yellowstone, as well as in Michoacan, Mexico, for the monarch butterfly migration. And it's this amazing opportunity to connect people to our natural resources and wildlife. And, I'm just very proud to be a guide with NatHab. But today we're going to focus on talking about the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and in particular, wildlife activity in the fall. This is a picture. All of these pictures in this presentation are ones that I've taken, and this is a picture up Ditch Creek, looking back at the Tetons. And in the foreground, those are actually horses. Those are not any kind of a wild animal. But this is the scene that you would see in, probably mid-October as the cottonwoods are yellow, and you're starting to see plants die back, and suddenly the temperatures are cooler, starting to get more snow at high elevations, and wildlife are changing their behavior. So first, I'd love to talk about the ungulates. Those are the hooved animals in these areas. So working our way around from the top left, on the top left, we have a pronghorn. Next, we have the bison. And then in the top right, we have an elk. Middle right, we have a mule deer. On the bottom, we have bighorn sheep. And on the left, we have moose. These are not all, but most of the ungulates that you'll see in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Just a couple fun tidbits to point out before we move on. If you look closely at that picture on the top right, that's an elk, and you're going to notice that he's missing something. He's actually missing an ear, and it's believed that he, as a young elk, probably had a really harsh winter and lost that ear to frostbite. Another fun thing that I like to point out here, and you can tell that's, if you could see the larger animal there, he's an incredibly healthy individual. Another thing I like to point out here, we'll talk about this behavior. Looking at that bison, you can see its purple tongue sticking out. And during this time of year, we're in August, heading into September, a lot of these animals are going into what we call the rut. And the rut is essentially mating season, where the males of each species start to get more aggressive, and that behavior of the tongue sticking out, that male bison is actually testing the air and using a vomeronasal organ within its nose that helps detect pheromones. And pheromones are a chemical they're chemicals that animals produce to communicate with one another, and that organ helps them detect them. So that male can actually sniff the air, and you'll see them push their nose out and kind of show the roof of their mouth. And that's exposing that organ to as much air as possible so that they can detect as many of those chemicals to be able to learn about the health of different individuals. It's kind of like getting a quick exam at the doctor and learning information about how healthy each individual is. So I love to point out just kind of fun things in the pictures. Here at the bottom, you're seeing bighorn sheep, and they're exhibiting one of their best adaptations to avoid predators by staying on these incredibly steep slopes in the mountains, and predators have a really hard time getting them in those areas, so that helps protect them. But let's talk about what these animals are doing. As we're in August now, we're looking ahead to September, October. We know a huge amount of information about these species due to a lot of research that has been done. So Yellowstone is the first national park in the country. And when it was set up, it was essentially, in a lot of ways, kind of showing what an ecosystem would look like if we have as minimal as of an impact on it as possible. So it set up kind of this grand experiment to see what wildlife do, again, with pretty minimal human interaction. And so one group that's really been spearheading a lot of the current research around migration routes is the Wyoming Migration Initiative, and they're out of the University of Wyoming. And this map here is showing migration routes of all of those animals that we were just looking at. So on the top left corner, and it might not be really easy depending on what screen you have to be able to see this, but I'll describe what we're looking at. On the top left, you have a key that tells you the different colors that we're seeing on the map represent different species. And so this is essentially a map produced by GPS collar data. So these scientists were able to put a collar on these animals that is pinging a satellite to be able to give data points for where those animals are located throughout the entire year. And then by putting all those data points into a visualization on top of a map, we're able to see a squiggly line that represents where that animal spent its time across the year and at specific moments along that calendar year. So here's zooming in a bit more. And we're starting to see how these animals have kind of this big network of a blob of color, essentially, and then a squiggly line, and then another blob of color. And that's showing the summering grounds and the wintering grounds. And as we're headed into the fall, these animals are starting to prepare for that big journey between those two habitats that they spend the year within. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how each of these species does that a little bit differently. You're also noticing on this map that if you start to look at the green color, the dark green, you're seeing that it shows up in a lot of different places on this map. And those are actually different populations of that species. So green is elk, and you're seeing that there's an elk population that stays entirely within Yellowstone National Park, and then there are some that are crossing the boundary. So let's take a look specifically at mule deer. So in this map, we're seeing the summer range of the mule deer and then all the way down to the winter range. So that is the migration route right there of a one specific population. And the mule deer itself takes only 27 days to make that journey. Whereas elk are going to take 28 days, pronghorn 32 days in the spring. Now, these pieces of information are kind of mind-blowing. This research came out in like the last 10 years, and we had no idea that these animals were making such great migrations. Some of these migrations are kind of almost on the scale of what we would picture in the Serengeti. And these animals are making these long distance treks in really short periods. Like for this, the fall migration of the pronghorn only takes 4 days, and they can travel as far as 250 miles from their summer to their wintering grounds. Part of the reason why these migrations were hidden is because if you remember this initial map, there are so many different populations of each animal that even throughout the year you might see pronghorn the whole time, but actually one of the populations that was in that area has actually made a 250-mile journey down to the Red Desert. So this new technology, moving away from radio telemetry, which requires the researcher to be able to have, the bunny ears device that you're in the field and you need to be within a certain distance, 2 to 3 miles usually, of the animal, and then you get a beep on your device to be able to tell you the direction and strength of that signal. And then you can make kind of rough ideas of where the animal is spending its time. GPS collars have suddenly allowed us to track animals in real time, and we're learning things that we just never knew before. So just cruising through these slides. This graphic kind of emphasizes that there are multiple populations of each ungulate species. Here we're looking at elk herds during the spring migration, so they're coming into Yellowstone National Park during the summer. And this slide is just going to run down how far each animal travels. And I've kind of tipped this off a little bit already, but when all of this research started coming out about these gigantic movements these animals are making, we just had no idea that they were traveling so far. So bighorn sheep travel about 20 miles between their summer and winter grounds. Moose travel about 65 miles. Bison on average travel about 70 miles, and then elk 168 miles, pronghorn about 200 miles, and mule deer 255. And so the big implication here is that these huge animals need vast landscapes to be able to support their success throughout the year. So this is where the interface between research that's happening and the knowledge of the general public, they need to be interfaced so that we can make conservation decisions regarding policy of wildlife corridors in particular, to be able to ensure that these animals can move across the landscape successfully. And all of these animals are gearing up to make this amazing migration for each of them this fall. Some of them are perhaps already kind of leaning towards making that movement. And all of these animals kind of go about it differently. As we saw before, some of them are traveling in just 4 days to cover 200 miles to be able to get to their wintering grounds. So that's the pronghorn and the mule deer. They move very quickly. Whereas other animals like bison, they're usually kind of traveling from their winter feeding grounds that are lower elevation, and they're slowly moving up into higher elevation areas. They move at a slower pace than the other animals when they're actually migrating. So here we have the mule deer being the winner for the longest recorded migration within North America, or at least within the 48, lower 48. So let's talk about why are these animals migrating. So this is a survival strategy, and this is one of the big behaviors that we're coming up towards. These wildlife, all of these animals that we've been talking about so far, are gearing up and getting ready for that big migration. So one of the reasons why these animals are migrating is that plants are starting to die back. They're less productive. In addition, as they senesce or die, they're becoming nutrient poor. So they're not as potent in what they can provide to animals. And so the wildlife are trying to find areas where there's enough forage to be able to support them through the winter. Another reason to migrate is that new food sources are becoming available as you move into the autumn. So one of the foods that moose love to eat are rose hips. And in this picture, you're seeing some bright red berries there that this moose is feeding on. So some foods are not available until this time. So then the animals are going to move into those areas to be able to feed. In addition, biology is shifting at this point. So animals are entering that period that I was talking about earlier, the rut, and that is changing where they're spending their time and the behaviors that you might observe. Male bison during this time are becoming more aggressive, and this picture kind of shows one of the behaviors that adults will do in a more aggressive way, which is kind of sparring with one another to compete for females. So this is a behavior that you would see around August, September, this time of year. And this picture was taken in Lamar Valley. You'll notice on that big male bison, even this picture was taken in late August, early September, and he still has some of that remnant winter coat that he's not been successful in scraping off yet. Elk are also in the rut during this time of year. This picture was taken towards the end of the rut. This was probably late, middle of October about. But elk have a different behavior this time of year. So bull elk are actually gathering as many cow elk as possible. And that grouping of cow elk is called a harem. And that single bull will protect that harem of cow elk and mate with all of those cows during the mating season and fend off any potential challenging bulls. And so during this time, this animal in particular, these bull elk that are protecting their harem, they are going to stop feeding and they're exclusively going to focus on protecting that harem because all of their energy has to go towards that. So this time of year, when we're sitting in July, August, early September, these elk need to feed as much as possible and put on as much weight as possible and be as healthy as they can so that they can successfully defend a group of female elk. The other reason why species are migrating is because snow is coming. And snow in high altitude areas is going to be deeper. It's going to be much more challenging to move around. Food is going to be much less available. So these animals are going to be moving to lower elevation areas and potentially different latitudes. So they might travel enough miles south from the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem to be able to get out of areas that are going to have really deep snowpack. With that said, one of the animals, I'm going to go back to an image of a bison. Um, one of the this animal in particular is fairly adapted to deep, deep snow. So they might have, if you remember back to how long their migration is in the fall, it's about 40 miles. It's not that far. And these animals are not migrating that far because they're really well adapted to deep snow. That huge hump they have on their back is actually a really big muscle attached to a bone spur off of their vertebra, and that's a modified vertebra to be able to support that muscle. And it is essentially allows them to use their head as a bulldozer. So they're pushing through that snowpack to be able to get down to forage throughout the winter. And that allows them to be able to survive in areas that have a deeper snowpack than other animals might be able to survive within. So as we're going into the fall migration, the big picture for all of these animals is basically get out of the mountains, head into the valleys, get to lower elevation, and if possible, move south or to areas that are going to have a more mild winter with less snow and more food availability. So now that we're looking at this map again, some of these lines might start to make a bit more sense as in terms of where these animals are moving. Winter can be an incredibly harsh time, and so animals are doing everything that they can to be able to get ready for the harsh conditions of winter. Moose in particular, as we look at their movements, in the summer they're going to move up in elevation into kind of the lowlands of the mountains, and as we move into the winter they're going to come back down into the valleys, into primarily the riparian zones, which are the ecosystems around rivers. And they're going to feed on willow. Even throughout the winter, they're going to be stripping branches of willow off and browsing on those, and trying to find as much as they can, and also saving as much energy as they can. So a big part of that is not traveling through deep snowpack, spending a good amount of time in each browse area, and then moving on to conserve energy. So they're at this point in the summer still trying to put on as much weight as possible, and eat as much forage as possible, because from here on out, all of the plant nutrients and quality is going to be quite a bit less. One of the unique situations that we have with elk as we head into the winter is that there is a elk feeding program run by the national government. And part of the reason for this is that the wintering grounds for elk are overlapped with areas that humans have developed. So in particular, this is really, really highlighted in Jackson Hole, where the elk are coming out of the mountains and moving down into the valley. And right where their wintering grounds used to be is the town of Jackson Hole. And when that area was first developed, people did not necessarily realize how much these elk relied on that area for their winter forage. It was just a little bit of an oasis with less snow and more food availability, where elk could survive, and that was taken away from them. And there was a big die-off event where thousands of elk starved to death over the winter. And that was the start of a program from the national government to be able to feed elk, to be able to help them survive the winter. And this is a program that's done with a lot of research and also a lot of debate around whether or not this is a productive program to engage in, because anytime you feed a wild animal, there are risks involved. And one of the primary risks is that you're gathering that animal into an area that's much more condensed than it would be otherwise. So this image was taken on the National Elk Refuge in the winter, and it's blurry in the background, but there's kind of a food storage area in the back right. And then tractors come out and deploy alfalfa pellets spread out as much as possible so that these animals can feed throughout the winter. And there are a lot of people studying how much forage, wild forage, is available in this area, the National Elk Refuge, so that they can supplement with alfalfa pellets to be able to ensure that the herd is healthy. But we've had a lot of concern in recent years about a number of different diseases, one of them being chronic wasting disease, that can really spread quickly and easily in conditions like this, where the animals are artificially brought close together, where one animal's saliva could be on the ground and then infect another animal as it's feeding in that same location. So this is really contentious and up for debate. And as chronic wasting disease enters more areas, we're going to see a lot more of this in the news. But I just wanted to highlight that example because elk are going to be moving towards their winter grounds, and in some areas, those wintering grounds are no longer available. And so it creates this wildlife management issue that we are facing, where we have to figure out what we want to do about that. Bison, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, are one of the animals that benefit from the elk feeding program, because you'll often see bison kind of moving into those areas and feeding on the alfalfa pellets too. So it's not possible to isolate wild populations, and this is another animal that's also going to be found on the National Elk Refuge in the winter, just north of Jackson Hole. This picture is one of my favorites. It was taken in the Grovant Mountains, which is across from the Grand Teton Mountains. And you're seeing this little track, and that track is actually a wolf track moving across the snow. So one of the animals that we haven't talked a lot about is the wolf, and they're just unbelievably adapted to winter. They've got these huge paws that act like snowshoes that allow them to travel across the top of the snow. And while winter is hard for them, they are one of the best adapted animals, and it's also one of the best times for wolf watching in Yellowstone. So that's another trip to be able to check out from Natural Habitat Adventures, to be able to see wolves in the winter. We haven't talked much about animals other than ungulates, and one of the animals that people are really hoping to see are bears, both grizzly bears and, like this picture, a black bear. So this was taken in Yellowstone National Park in about July. And so this is a bear cub, and this is the mama bear. And this is the whole family. There were two cubs and a mama bear eating some clover. And this animal is a particularly fun animal to talk about as we head into fall. Because as you know, bears are an animal that hibernates over the winter. And so as soon as they come out of hibernation, they are on a mission to eat as much food as possible. But as we come into autumn, and like I said, food is becoming a little bit less available, that's when bears actually enter this new phase called hyperphagia. And hyperphagia is just eating as much as humanly possible, or not humanly, but barely possible, to be able to put on as much fat stores as they can to be able to get into winter. And I love this picture, and I love this interaction, because bears are omnivores and they're opportunistic. So they're going to feed on whatever is available, and they're going to eat as much of it as they can before moving on to the next food source. At times, you'll have grizzly bears that are climbing up into the mountains to feed on moths, and yes, you heard me right, MOTHS, moths. And sometimes you'll have bears just feasting on berries. And in recent years, you're seeing more and more grizzlies feeding on elk babies, which is a story for another time, but one worth looking into because of a really interesting interaction with different trophic cascades. So coming back to the main theme here of what these animals are doing as we get into the fall, is that bears are just eating as much as they can um, and heading into the winter. And one of my favorite facts about bears is that as a pregnant female is going into the den, researchers have been able to correlate her fat stores, the number of inches of fat stores that she has, to the number of cubs that she gives birth to over the winter as she's still hibernating in the den. And so that's, a huge connection to the overall population of bears, is how healthy they are, how much food they've had over the summer as they go into the winter. And so if you're aware of what food source they're tapping into in a particular season, you've got a better chance of being able to try and find some wildlife and find bear sightings in particular. And I mentioned earlier talking about wolves. This is a picture of one of my favorite wolves that I got to observe quite a few times. She was identified as 926F. She's got a radio collar around her neck that you can barely see in that image because this was taken in really low light conditions. And she's looking across the Lamar Valley, which is one of our favorite places for wildlife watching in Yellowstone National Park. And again, these animals are so well adapted for the winter. They have slightly different areas that they'll spend time in, but really they're following the elk herds as they go into autumn and into fall and into the winter. But they're very mobile and they'll cover a lot of ground. And they move differently and have different patterns than some of those ungulates that are a little bit more predictable. So that kind of wraps up the overview conversation of what are wildlife doing in the fall. And now I'd love to talk about the itinerary of what you can do in Grand Teton and Yellowstone with natural habitat adventures. And this is a 7-day itinerary, and it's really geared around wildlife viewing. So this trip departs either from Jackson Hole in the south and then travels all the way through the park, both parks, and makes its way to Bozeman, or you do that in the reverse direction. In addition to wildlife viewing, you also have the opportunity to learn about geothermal features. Yellowstone National Park is a supervolcano, and it has these amazing hot springs and geysers and fumaroles and different features that make it a very otherworldly place to explore. And that interface between all of those geothermal features, those geologic facets of the environment, they have so much interplay with what the wildlife are doing and where they're spending their time. And we've touched on that a little bit in this conversation so far. But that's what makes this trip so special, is that you get to see wildlife in a very natural state and interacting with geology that is nothing short of kind of mind-blowing. So in this particular quick look at the itinerary, we're starting in Jackson Hole, and then we're making our way to Bozeman. So you'll arrive in the evening, or you can even spend a couple days ahead of the trip before we have our first welcome dinner. But we'll meet in Jackson and have a welcome dinner. We'll meet the group. These groups are really special groups of people. Everyone who does a natural habitat adventure trip is united behind this idea that places we travel to are places we also want to conserve and protect. And that relationship that Natural Habitat Adventures has with World Wildlife Fund is really what makes traveling with NatHab so special, because you know that a portion of your trip is going towards conservation. And then in addition to that, the impact that you're having while traveling is reduced as much as possible. And the way that NatHab structures their trips are to partner with groups that are already doing great work in terms of making sure that the natural resources are managed sustainably. So that first night is really meeting the folks in the group, meeting your guides, getting introduced to essentially this presentation that I'm giving now of a quick look at what you'll be doing over the next 7 days. Day 2 is staying in Grand Teton National Park. You'll float on the Snake River. You'll look for wildlife in the sagebrush flats and hopefully see this pronghorn, which is the fastest land mammal in North America. Can reach speeds of 60 miles per hour. And just a really interesting animal to observe. You'll also have a chance to be able to see moose, perhaps some wolves if you're lucky. I've actually had a lot of success with wolf watching in the winter in Grand Teton in the last 5 years, as opposed to the years prior to that. So that's a really, really special day in Grand Teton, and there's a lot of amazing views of the mountains and learning a bit about the geology of that area, because these mountains were formed very differently than the mountains in Yellowstone. The next day, we're spending it near Old Faithful Geyser Basin, and we spend quite a bit of time with the geothermal features. So this picture on the right is of Yellowstone Lake. That's West Thumb Geyser Basin, where you actually have some geothermal features inside the lake. And a portion of that lake was actually a caldera of one of the eruptions that has happened. On the left, you're seeing an image from Old Faithful Geyser Basin, and we have a beehive erupting, which is one of the less frequent and less predictable geysers, which is a really fun one to be able to see. On the next day, we really dive into our wildlife viewing portion. You'll visit Hayden Valley, which is a great wildlife viewing area. That's the picture on the left. We'll stop by Artist's Point, which is where Thomas Moran painted his very iconic image of the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone River. And that painting actually was a huge part of the reason why ultimately we decided as a country to conserve the first national park, and talk about the history of Yellowstone National Park and how it came to be conserved. And then the next day is in our wildlife watching haven of Lamar Valley. This is where all the die-hard wolf watchers are spending their time. They're camping and exploring this area. And for us, we're currently staying in Gardner to be able to access Lamar Valley and be able to spend as much time there as possible. So this part of the trip is really geared around when wildlife are active. So a lot of wildlife are active, they're crepuscular, so they're active during early morning and late evening. And so we try and really be out there at dawn and dusk and provide a bit of a break in the middle of the day to be able to really extend and maximize the times when wildlife are most active. The next day, again, this is our best chance for wolves, our best chance for grizzly bears, black bears, and so we spend another day exploring Lamar Valley with the hopes of seeing this amazing animal here on the left. On day 7, we make our way to Bozeman, and that completes our trip, and we have our departures out of Bozeman. And so that is the most cursory look that I can possibly give in terms of where we spend our time and what we're doing. But I can't speak highly enough of this trip. I'm so excited to be going on another one of these trips this September. It's really a thoughtfully built itinerary that maximizes your chance of being able to see all of the wildlife that Yellowstone and Grand Teton can provide. So just a little bit more about me. If you enjoyed today's presentation, I do a monthly publication from my website, which is twolined.com. And you can check out those stories by going to twoline.com/tracks. And in particular, I have a focus on peatlands. And peatlands are these ecosystems that are havens for biodiversity, and they also store an incredible amount of carbon. They're essentially wetlands where vegetation has been allowed to be trapped and it doesn't decompose. So these pictures that you're seeing here are of some peatlands near my house here in Adirondack Park. I'm calling in from Saranac Lake. And these are just really special places that in the past we've had a very complicated relationship with, that we've not seen the value of our wetlands and our peatlands, and we've drained them as a species. And so we're starting to recognize the value of these places, and we're starting to conserve them. And so you can follow along with my work to be able to see images and videos of these places and to learn about why these areas are so important to conserve and restore as we move forward. So if you'd like to get in touch with me, feel free to reach out by email or on Instagram. This QR code will bring you to that page where I post all my publications, stories from the field. And we'll open up this last segment of the chat to questions that you might have about traveling with an AdHab or about Grand Teton and Yellowstone, or even about peatlands. So thank you so much for tuning in today.
Oh, that was so fantastic, Charlie. I wish that I was in Yellowstone right now watching all the excitement start as fall gets nearer. And everybody, in case you missed Charlie's fantastic peatland webinar, I just pulled it up. It's in our archives on the website in the conservation and travel tips section. And it was posted on July 16th with, you actually had a guest that one. It was Dr. J. Kurt Stager. It was fantastic. So I recommend diving into the archives there and checking that one out after this one if you're interested in learning more about Charlie's work with peatlands. It was a fantastic webinar. But we have a ton of questions here, and they are all so good. And I recommend everybody, if you have any questions for Charlie, we'll take questions for about the next 10-15 minutes. Put them in your control panel in your GoToWebinar control panel. So let's just start diving in, Charlie. We got lots here. So I think one of the first places we should start is what is the most ideal time of the year to go on this trip as far as colors go and in terms of animals' activity levels?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love being in Yellowstone and Grand Teton any time of the year. You really can't go wrong. But with that said, September, October is amazing for wildlife activity because one, you start to have less crowds, and less crowds means that you have more flexibility to be able to pull off at different areas and be able to scan and look for wildlife. But also during those times, it's starting to get a little bit cooler, and that's triggering a lot of these wildlife movements that I've been talking about during this presentation. So they're starting to think about migrating, so they're gathering up as herds. And so September, October is great. I mean, and in terms of fall color, this is one that's always hard to time, no matter what habitat you're trying to go to. But the encouraging thing is from about mid-September until mid-October is basically when I would say that you have a good window to be able to see fall color. And the nice thing about this trip is you actually cover a lot of elevation. So as you're entering Yellowstone Park and getting into Yellowstone, you're going into some higher elevation areas. And what that means is that as fall progresses, fall progresses down the mountain, right? Spring goes up the mountain, fall comes down. So higher elevation areas are going to turn colors sooner, and then lower elevations will be later. So if you time your trip mid-September to mid-October, somewhere along that elevational climb, you're going to find fall color. But if I were to plan like my ideal trip, it would be somewhere at the end of September. The 15th through the 30th essentially would be the sweet spot where you'd start to see fall color. A lot of the wildlife are doing really interesting things during the rut and as they get ready to migrate. And you have a good chance for fall color and activity then. So that's my general answer to that question.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, and the crowds have usually died down pretty well after that too, post Labor Day. I'll throw that in
Absolutely.
there as well. So this is a good question to address. How close do groups get to ungulates on adventures? Is it close enough to see without scopes or binoculars, or do we pretty much always need those tools throughout the trip?
So it really depends. You can't guarantee anything, right? Like there's no guarantee. Wildlife are wild. They're going to go where they're going to go. The chances that you're going to see with your naked eye a wolf like this are very, very low. We like to the scopes that we travel with are really high quality. And when we set up in an area like this on the right here, we're just having, a meal and having conversation. But when we're setting up the scopes, we're looking at hillsides behind there. And it would not be unheard of to see a wolf on that first ridge line that you see in the distance, or even the second one. So when you're looking through the scope, you might see a view like this on the left. But with your naked eye, that animal is going to be quite small. And there are distances that we have to stay. When we're outside of our vehicle, we have to stay a certain distance from all of these wildlife. But we also have rooftop hatches in the vehicles. So if we're pulled off, we're in park, and your guide tells you it's safe to do so, you can open up that hatch and then view from within the vehicle, which allows us to be as close as those animals come towards us. We do everything we can to make sure that we're not changing the behavior of wildlife. But if we set up and we're in the vehicle and a herd of bison moves towards us and we're safely within the vehicle, they could be incredibly close. Um, Bison are one that you're likely going to have great views of very, very close, without the need for any optics at all. Binoculars are a great tool, and we provide those. If you have your own that you prefer, you're welcome to bring those. But this is a look at the scopes that we use on these trips. So it really depends on the animal. Pronghorn tend to stay a bit further away, but depending on the time of year and where the wildlife are at that particular moment in time, you might get a nice close look at a pronghorn as well. So it's really dependent on the wildlife, really dependent on the scenario, but the scopes are so powerful that they really can give you an experience that feels like you're very close and personal with that animal, even if it's 200 yards away.
Yeah, the scopes really do help this trip quite a lot. I will say, having adventured quite a lot myself throughout Yellowstone. So, we have a ton of biological and ecological questions in here, which I love. And let's see how many of them we can get through. We do have
Good.
quite a lot about the wasting disease, and these are good questions. So, for the bison that go to that elk refuge, is it possible for the wasting disease to jump to bison?
It is. And one thing I'll mention, I was pretty vague and broad when I was talking about CWD, chronic wasting disease. So it is a prion disease. It's a really scary one because it's so transmittable. And that animal, once it contracts it, it's basically a death sentence. Um, and it's one of the diseases that's being tracked incredibly heavily by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, by various different research institutions. And so I would recommend kind of looking up some articles, especially look up like National Elk Refuge, Jackson Hole, chronic wasting. And there will be a lot of articles that come up talking about the anticipation that this disease is going to show up. And a lot of people are thinking about what do we do when that happens. Bison are another species that can get chronic wasting disease, so it could potentially affect them as well. But there are a lot of different diseases that herd animals have the potential of getting. Some of them are less severe than others, skin diseases or fungal infections. Um, but some of them are more serious and take some pretty extensive management. David Quammen published a book for Yellowstone's 150th anniversary with National Geographic, and it goes into our bison management um, for a population that migrates outside of the national park into Montana, and there's a culling program in place to maintain the population at a certain number, and also to manage for some of these diseases to ensure that they're not becoming rampant. So that's another kind of ecological story to dive into. We don't have time to cover that now, but I'm just kind of teasing a couple topics that are definitely worth looking into and checking out.
And to stay on it for a little bit longer, is it possible for this particular disease to jump to other groups of animals like predators, wolves, or cougars, or anything like that?
I'd have to look into that. The studies that I've seen have been talking about ungulates in particular, elk being the primary one, and mule deer. But I'd have to look into that in terms of how it spreads to other species as well.
It's a good follow-up question. So, this is a fantastic one too. So you were just talking about, that incredible muscle that bison have to be able to forage in the wintertime. What are they digging for? What is the foliage available to them during that time of year?
Yeah, so a lot of the time, bison are spending their time in meadows, and they're feeding on any number of forbs and grasses, and they're a ruminant, so they're going to be able to eat those kind of plants that are a little bit harder to break down for other animals. And I'm trying to remember the other part of the question. Yeah. So this made me think of another kind of fun story. So I was talking about the interaction between wildlife and the geology, the very special geology that's unique to Yellowstone. So this is an interesting story that I love to share when we're near a geothermal feature. So when you think of a hot spring, the hot spring itself, there are a lot of minerals within the water of that spring, and those minerals can actually be taken up through the roots of the plant and be incorporated into the plant material. And so one of those minerals is silica. And silica component used, in glass, so you can kind of picture that. So bison, hot springs obviously are warm, right? And so in the winter, there's less snow around the hot spring, and bison will forage along the edge there. But that plant has a lot of silica within it. Those plants, not just one, but all the different plants that grow there, pick up some of the silica, and it actually will grind their teeth down. And so bison have adapted, evolved to be able to only, they essentially know how much to eat so that they don't wear down their teeth so much. So they can have just a little bit of it to help tide them over. It's an easier food source, but some of them will eat so much of it that they'll actually wear down their teeth and not be able to feed anymore. So that's just kind of an interesting interaction between wildlife behavior and geology that's specific to this area. But they essentially are just trying to find any forage that they can, any vegetation that they can feed on. One of the prominent plants in this area is sagebrush. They are not feeding on sagebrush. That's a really fairly toxic plant to try and eat because that has these tannins within the plant that help prevent herbivory. But they're feeding on basically everything else. So that's a great question.
Speaking of feeding, let's go to the other side of the food chain, predators. Are predators following these ungulates as they migrate, or are they staying put?
Yeah, definitely. So uh, when we look at, um, trying to find a good map, land on one right now, but yes, so these wolf populations are um, moving around, following the elk. They're gonna go towards where the elk are in their elk wintering range, um, and uh, and they also have kind of hunting areas that they like to spend time in where different species will overlap because wolves will feed on any number of those ungulates, all of them, opportunistically. They have a very close relationship with the elk herd, so they will follow them. And this kind of brings up one of the topics that we've touched on a little bit. Like a lot of what I've been talking about is that these animals are moving much longer distances than we ever imagined, and that essentially heightens this importance of wildlife corridors, of ensuring that wildlife have the ability to travel the whole length of the corridor that they need to move along to get to their wintering grounds or their summering grounds. because they're moving there because they can have a better chance of surviving, or even the only chance of surviving through the winter. And wolves in particular, one of the big stories that we've been following is that as wolves come on and off of the endangered species list, that has implications for the management of the wolf. So if a wolf is on the endangered species list, that's federally protected. So wolves cannot be hunted. But if wolves are removed from the endangered species list, then you've opened up the opportunity to hunt them depending on the state management plans. So for Montana, for Idaho, for Wyoming, outside the boundary of the national park, which you cannot hunt within the national park for wolves. Um, if that animal leaves that boundary and the wolf is not protected under the endangered species list, and that state allows hunting, that wolf can be killed. So there's a lot of dynamics. You remember that map, um, of if you look at the top end of this map, kind of where the fall migration is blocking it a little bit, those elk herds are moving north out of the park, and wolves will often follow them, which puts them potentially, depending on, because this changes a lot very frequently, depending on what the laws are currently, can open them up to being hunted. So a little bit of a side note from that question, but thank you for the question.
Oh, I'm totally in support of any chance we could talk about conservation in the state of things. So thanks always for that. There are still so many fantastic questions in here, but I think that we're going to have to close it down because we're definitely running out of time. So, Charlie, I would love to send it back to you for any closing comments.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining me today, and talking, just kind of brushing the surface of what are wildlife up to in the fall. There's so much to cover. If you ever get the opportunity to travel there, or even travel with Natural Habitat Adventures, it's a truly incredible ecosystem to be able to experience. So thanks for tuning in. Feel free to get in touch if you have more questions. And thank you, Brooke, for hosting.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time to present to us today, Charlie, and thanks to everyone who tuned in today. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.